Good night, Irene. I have a cousin, Irene. She often stands downtown with a severe, condemnatory look, as if the world has disappointed her. She doesn't know who Walt Whitman is. If she did, he could be in for a real good talking to. In the early 1990s, it's probably 1992, I started receiving in my English department mailbox at Salem State these envelopes containing a cheap-looking, self-published book of poems with a handwritten note saying, "If you like these, send $5, please," to a name and an address. The name was Malcolm Miller. In those days, I was a little disdainful of self-publication. It certainly hadn't become as popular as it is today. And I wasn't interested, and I basically put these books aside. But I thought if you're going to have to beg for your livelihood, you could do worse than using poetry. So I'd always send off the $5 to this Malcolm Miller with a Salem address. And sure enough, a few months later, another book would come. And so it would go for years. And I don't know what prompted me over 10 or 20 years later to look through some of these books, but to my surprise, I found he was a very good poet.
All over the world. All over the world, people with wide skulls or narrow are smashing cars apart against trees or one another. All over the world, people are going on vacation merrily or finding out they do not love who they have just married. People in Singapore and Vermont are realizing life can be holy, and in Oregon are butchering hogs while others rebel against authority because of insight or their stomach is upset.
I started working at the Salem State University Library in 1998, and that was where I met Malcolm. He would come in all the time. Other people who worked at the library told me that he was a local poet and that he was essentially homeless, that he had no fixed address, and that he would write in coffee shops all night long, and then he would come to the library and sleep on our couches or show up in different parts of the Salem State campus quite often.
I was a police officer here in the city of Salem for 32 years. Prior to that, I served with the Salem State College at the time, now University, campus police from 1979 through 1981.
For Malcolm Miller, how did you know him? How did you cross paths with him?
It was actually via a complaint from somebody that had called in from the library.
What kind of complaint would people make about it?
That he was an undesirable, that he was making people nervous, that he had been in the library for long periods of time. Some people complained that there was things offensive about him, that he had a smell, that he looked like he was not properly dressed. And I remember on at least one occasion he was in the bathroom actually cleaning up, washing some of his clothes.
Around 2012, 2013, I was the faculty editor of the magazine Soundings East, which is a national literary magazine, but it's published with an editorial board made up of students. But as the advising faculty member, I played a role in that publication, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be good to publish some of these poems legitimately? Now, I knew his address, of course, and I would write to him. I invited him to come and talk to my poetry students. He refused. I invited him to read at Salem State College. He refused, writing that he was too old and too infirm and too much of a recluse.
My mother has to go to the rehab hospital. I come to her old place to pick up a few things, mail and the like, and out the window see in the park under the low-hanging shade, trees, a woman sitting in a chair right where Mother used to sit. From this angle and distance, it almost is Mother, but she will never sit under the summer trees again. She is lying in the red brick rehabilitation hospital like a doll in its crib. She will never sit under the summer trees again, and the only hope now is she doesn't know it.
Somehow would cross paths from time to time, and probably, if I'm remembering correctly, it was at Forest River Park in Salem that I would often see him, and we'd be playing a little sandlot baseball, football, and things like that. And we hung out at that corner right by Salem State, which has changed quite a bit now, but the fellows from World War II were just starting to come back, and we were a little bit younger. But it was there where at about 6 o'clock you all assembled, and then we'd go our various ways. And then I got to know Mally even better then. It wasn't that he was an overpowering personality, but he was interesting to talk to. And I think that's what probably drew us all together. I think I might have always known that Mally would end up writing. I wasn't sure what, but he seemed to have sort of an author's mentality.
So if years from now, someone were curious to know, who was this Malcolm Miller? What was he like? What would you say?
I would say an artistic sociopath without the charm. Because if you're going to be a sociopath, you should really please people at least. And he didn't feel he needed to make that effort. So I think that was the thing that scared us about him.
I only knew him during the period of his life, during a very short period of his life. But he had the potential for a deterioration in which he would be very, I think sociopath surprised me when you said that, and yet he was sociopathic. All that, I've not been afraid of anybody really,
Right.
And he was very frightening.
Physically, he carried himself in chest out kind of guy, and he'd always cock his head back and look down his nose at you. So it was a look that said, you got something to prove to me. He would play games with anything that he knew about you or could think about you. This will give you an idea. One of the guys who worked at the newspaper on the Fringe, his name was Bruce Shatswell. And Miller never called him anything but Shatwell. And that's how he would come through the door to, Shatwell, what's happening today? Is it getting any better for you? And turning his name, into some form of Mal's unique scatology, which I have to say he was a very scatological guy too.
Take two.
No. I walked through a store and heard a toothbrush on the shelf saying, I wonder whose mouth I'll end up in. I rushed terrified into the street. There I thought, you must face this. I returned to the store, moving along rows of painkillers, passing a container of aspirins. I heard the aspirin saying, when I have a headache, nothing helps.
he had a little manual portable typewriter that he would carry around, and he would set himself up at my kitchen table for 1 morning, 2 mornings, no more than 3 mornings at a time, and type out what would turn out to be one of these books, which were usually around 72 pages or thereabouts. Later on, even after he had his own apartment, he told me that either the apartment was too noisy for him to concentrate in, or that the sound of his own typing would be disturbing to his other neighbors. So again, over the years, what turned out to be over a decade, he would show up every few months and spend a few mornings at my kitchen table.
I was a waitress there. I was 15, maybe 16 when I met him. We used to serve coffee and muffins. It was a little like colonial style place. And Malcolm would come in, and he was, I noticed him, and we had a lot of customers, but I noticed him because he was different from everybody else. He was always writing. He wore one of those, I call them Irish hats, but this certain kind of hat that goes like this with a visor, and he always seemed very dignified. I remember talking to him about evolution of all things in in a coffee shop, and he was intelligent, he was serious, and I always liked him, and I know he liked me too. Some years went by, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years, and I bumped into him at a party, and I went out with him. So now I was about 20, and Malcolm was, I think, maybe 45. So it was a little kind of, strange, age-wise. And we would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and even if it was cold, we'd go to the beach, and he would say, "Oh, the beach is so wonderful, and the air and everything." And he just loved everything about, nature, and he was so different, so different.
The music. I am sitting in a cafe, wasting my life. Why don't you come and join me? I'm easy to get along with. I don't care if you stagger with wonder at existence and cry out, or if your nights disappear into women's bodies and accomplish nothing the world pretends is real. I will shake your hand warmly if you laugh at the sky, if you never vote. What finally gave me a chance to meet him was when I had a stack of 10 copies of the literary magazine with his poems in it. He was the featured poet of that issue. The students, as it turned out, were thrilled with his poetry too. And I went over to his address in Salem in public housing in a settlement called Pioneer Terrace and rang the doorbell. I had to wait a long time for an answer, and the person who came to the door was a very old and sick-looking, tall man who invited me in, told me to go up to the second floor. I went up the staircase, and he sat down on the staircase just to catch his breath and to regroup his energies. He was in pretty bad shape. But both of us made it up to his apartment in public housing, and he had one chair in his room, which he took. I went into his kitchen and found another chair and sat down, and the two of us began our conversation and our acquaintance.
Patty and I were math teachers together at Salem High School and were friends for a long time. And she was married at the time, but got divorced. And after she was divorced, she started up a relationship with Malcolm. And she lived with me. She was living here for about 6 months on and off, and then another 6 months at a different time.
And suddenly, this Malcolm Miller appears on the scene.
On the scene, right.
For you guys. And if Patty was taken by him, can I assume you were taken by him as well?
No way. We were like, what is she thinking? You know, she's beautiful and slim and graceful and funny and talented. And Malcolm was kind of a curmudgeon, wouldn't you say?
Definitely a good word for him. He was a curmudgeon, and he was
Kind of sardonic. He wasn't even sarcastic. He didn't make any effort to befriend us, except for making caustic comments whenever you engaged him in conversation. I think he just thought, my feeling is, he just thought he was a superior human being, and we were just housewives. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, I suppose that's true. I don't think he liked me because I was bourgeois, because I was Jewish, even though he was Jewish. I don't think it just felt I wasn't imaginative.
I think we weren't elevated enough.
Everyone loved him because he was so funny. And he had this, alienated but engaged perspective on these streets and this world that people were sharing in Salem in those days. And it really was very cool. As a Salem kid, he had street cred, and he was almost like a politician. But I realized, as I got to know him better, I realized Mal, he didn't have clothes. He didn't have a car. He didn't have any of the trappings of a successful or moderately successful 44-year-old man at the time of the bicentennial. There was something that was really, there was some profound unease that Malcolm had in relation to society.
Conquistador. To set out of a morning and take the first fresh light on your sleep-dimmed skin and reckon with the sea banging out its call for volunteers to taste the cold tidal salt, to lure a careful cat successfully to play and feel the rich fur and be hypnotized by its eyes, to drown in the general drift of things, no more important than a tree or a brick in a wall, to go from way to way like a current of air, or like a campfire story told over and over, to gaze at the sky changing and to know in 10,000 years my kind will be gazing, and to come home baffled by the wonder of things, to sit in your room glowing like a star.
I would venture to say that it was dozens of times that somebody would be either frightened by him or they wanted him moved along, and in each one of those, they pretty much all began and ended the same way. A bit confrontational, and I actually did try a couple of times to talk to him. Anybody that knows me knows I talk to people from A to Z, and I like to hear people's stories. I've talked to homeless people, I've talked to people that have just gotten out of prison, and I've always been interested in people. I could never get anywhere with Malcolm Miller. I've tried to talk to him on a couple of occasions, just during the encounters, just to try to disarm him a little bit, never with any success. I tried to get a sense of who he was and what he was all about, particularly after I saw the letters to the editor in the local paper, and it's almost as if he never let his guard down. So I can't say that although I tried to get into substantive conversations, never. It always got right back to, you can't tell me what to do here, and it just became, unfortunately, that negative type of encounter.
One of my earliest memories of Mal, he had rented a cabin in Rockport with Sandra, his wife. And the memories sort of blend. And what I remember is Sandra making a salad in this beautiful wooden bowl. I don't know why I remember this wooden bowl. And she was really beautiful. She was, I believe, from Canada, and she was from a tribe up there, and she would dress in traditional garb. Like she had a suede outfit on that was beaded. She had long jet black hair. I was just fascinated by her. And Mel had a beagle named Joey, and so out behind the cabin were woods, and we would go and we'd take walks.
Now, he had been married years before, and his wife was something of a shadowy figure that not much was known about. But he told me that while she was a Russian Jew, she looked like she was a Native American. She had striking black hair and a dark complexion, and that she was a great beauty. And many of his poems refer back to her and to their passionate love. So a great area of investigation for me is to find out a little bit more about her. But she developed early in her life a fatal sickness, and she was here in Salem with him, but returned to Canada, where they have health insurance for everybody for her treatment, and he didn't go with her.
And then that memory, for some reason, segs to the Wax Museum. And what we're looking at is this tableau of a woman with a hook through her, hanging over, it was like a horror show, all right? And she's hanging over this platform, and there's all this wax blood everywhere. And I'm small enough that I'm trying to climb up and put my face into his pocket. Like, that's the perspective, and his pocket's up here, and I can't get in because it was so scary to me. But he said to me, and this I always remembered, was, you know, there's beauty in everything. And so maybe 10 years later, you know, I'm a teenager and I'm at the drive-in and I'm watching, I think it's either Freddie or Jason slash their way down Elm Street. And it's this 5-story ballet of blood that's going on. And that stayed with me. I remember, oh yeah, Mel was right.
When you've read and actually typed out as many of Malcolm Miller's poems as I have, and at this point I'm up to over 750 pages of transcriptions, you get familiar with many of his themes, his images, his motifs, his concerns, his preoccupations. He believed that our mission in life was to become fully alive, fully in tune with what it meant to be alive, fully a part of the universe. And one of the ways that he expressed that was almost in a capacity to hear a kind of singing in the universe, that when you reach that stage of being fully alive, you could not only hear, but you could sing with. Sometimes the thought was expressed in terms of a road in life, that he would find and follow a road that was nearly impassable or impassable to others, or that was very demanding and lonely and rain-sodden, and yet you would need to pursue this to reach that stage of being fully alive.
You gotta walk that lonesome valley. You gotta walk it for yourself. Ain't nobody here can walk it for you. You gotta walk it by yourself. Daddy walked that lonesome valley. My daddy walked it for himself. Ain't nobody here can walk it for him. He had to walk it by himself.
In the morning from my grandmother's, and he would walk 25 miles a day. And sometimes, I don't know if he had a room that he wrote in at Salem State, but he had stolen a doctor's lab coat, and it still had the doctor's name on it. And he would put this lab coat on, and he would just cruise Lafayette Street, and women would sort of walk by and say, oh, well, hello, doctor, and he would nod. And
I remember when we were in the Radio Shack when he was purchasing his transistor radio. We went up to the counter, and Malcolm Miller was very independent. He didn't want or need any help from me, but I could watch. And there was a pretty young clerk, blonde girl, perhaps in her 20s, and while she was ringing him up, he looked at her very intensely and said, "Do you know who Walt Whitman is?" And she was a little flustered, and she said, "Well, that name sounds familiar, but no, I can't place him." And at this point, the store manager came over, man in his 30s, and said, yeah, Walt Whitman, he's in Breaking Bad. He would go to the grocery store by himself or get a cab, but he was happy to take advantage of my helping him that day. I didn't get a very good look at what he was buying, but it was mostly cans and jars. In his later years, he developed a taste for grapefruit juice. I didn't drink alcohol at all, though as a younger man, he apparently had a taste for scotch. A story I'd heard about that.
I remember this one time coming back into the house, and he was walking out down the front steps of the porch, and he had a bottle of scotch in his hand, and he said, "Caught in the act, stealing your scotch." And off he went. You know what? I didn't give Patty a hard time about it, because we didn't drink scotch anyway. It was probably left over from college, from Doug's college years, and we probably didn't want it anyway. But still, it wasn't very nice.
Later that day, we drove to the grocery store, to Crosby Market in Salem. And I again drove right up to the front of the store where there is a bench. And there was a middle-aged woman sitting on the bench, probably waiting for a ride. And he walked right up to her and said, "Who gave you permission to sit here?" And presumably he was joking around with her, but you could see how he would get the reputation that he had for being an occasionally disturbing presence.
It didn't endear him to us, or to me anymore, once I had heard that Patty was driving the getaway car while he was shoplifting at Marshall's.
And what was that all about?
I think he felt entitled by his genius, that he was owed support like a patron, and so whatever he chose, he took.
So the family didn't really find much value in Mal. They only saw what he could take, and they never saw what he could give. A lot of them thought he was crazy. And the thing that, I have to say, in my family, there's a very thin line between eccentricity and mental illness, and so they saw Mal. A lot of people saw Mal as being mentally ill because they saw him as someone who wasn't able, or I don't even want to say mentally ill, but he wasn't able to maintain a job. He never had a home. He didn't have a phone. He didn't have a car. He didn't have things. My father died when I was 14, and Mal came over and cleaned out his closet, and for 20 years, as long as he could fit into the clothes, that's what he wore.
So we would walk in with old shoes and try on a pair of shoes that fit and leave the old shoes there and walk out with the new shoes.
Did Patty know that was what he was going to do? Or?
Yeah, that's how I learned. Mm-hmm. And Linda learned. She told us this. She didn't feel, she was ethical, moral, careful, but somehow or another, we used to call Malcolm Svengali. We thought that he had
a hold on her, right?
Yeah.
In addition to which,
make her change her way of being.
The thing about Patty was she did fit herself to whatever man she was with. So she could be a Republican one day and a man later a Democrat. She was very malleable in her relationship with men.
I loved Malcolm Miller with my whole heart and soul because he was funny, he was brilliant, he was playful, and he worshiped me. He wrote beautiful poems about our relationship, about our travels, and I love those poems.
Kind of education. I loved a woman in that city. It was the end of winter. The snow lay embarrassed in the lanes at its tenuousness. The trees stood around awkwardly. She was a woman of that city. It was not her way to speak of things, not her way to hear them out. She would walk faster when I spoke of them, her face buried. It was before spring. We would walk through the wet streets together. When I was close, something struck like a great gong through every bone and each fibre of my blood. Under the gray sky, tumultuous and uneasy, she felt safe in her silences, steering her even course. I, a companion who had abandoned all others for her. And I was right to do so. In love with a woman who was the wrong woman. It was a kind of education in the beauty and impossibility of things. A good question is, why would people read Malcolm Miller's poetry? Why is he deserving of publication and posterity? What are the strengths of his poems? I think that not every reader will love the poems as much as I do and others do. Poetry, I think, contains a lot of styles and expressions. And Malcolm Miller's, I would say, if anything, tend to be more on the narrative side and more on the prosy side. Or maybe another way of saying that is his poems are not inaccessible. They are not written with an associational quality that makes you feel that you have to follow a stream of images that on the surface may not seem related. You don't have that with him. His poems are fairly accessible on first or second reading, and they're about something. I'm a fiction writer more than a poet myself, and I find that maybe he's sort of a fiction writer's poet in that respect.
I am having a cup of tea. That does not sound adventurous or important. But if you saw the orange-brown color deep in the white china cup, if you felt the heat pour into your hands, if you breathed the aroma, you would probably stand up shouting out the name of a god.
I mainly thought of it as wonderful, street-level, humorous poetry that actually had a great following in our in the people who read our newspaper.
How did you know it had a following?
Because I, amongst my many jobs at that place, I had to distribute most of the copies of the newspaper to all the variety stores around town. First, they wanted to see what was the big political story of the week. We're only a weekly. And then often the next thing they wanted to do was check out Malcolm's poems because it would make them laugh. I realized Mal knew everyone downtown in those days. He knew all the cops. He knew all the advertising guys. He knew everyone on the street, and his patter with people was almost the same as his poems.
Mystery. I don't know why, but there has to be something more to a carrot than stick-like orange Christmas. Ditto a purple, glowing eggplant or a bunch of red beets. You can't tell me they are just ordinary vegetables. For God's sake, regard a fine onion and you almost know something more.
I found all these letters from the 50s, and Mal and his oldest brother's name was Harvey, and they were very close, and you could see from the letters they wrote back and forth when they were both in the service. And in a lot of the letters from Mal, they would all go through their mother, Alice, my grandmother, because she lived in Salem. So she would be this courier of letters. And so in a lot of Mal's letters to Harvey, he would say, "Can you swap me $25?" But at the same time, it would be because he was traveling through Italy. And so other letters, Mal would be telling Harvey, this is how you travel. This is how to do it. Take this train out of here. And they would talk a lot about writing. And so they had this very close relationship. I mean, one of the letters, Mal even says to Harvey,
this small publisher wants to publish some of my poems, and I don't know if I want to do it. So it wasn't that Mal couldn't. He just had a relationship. He had no relationship to money. He didn't find any value in it, except to allow you to travel and have the most basic needs, because he really didn't need more than that. I mean, he was genuinely, he typed. That's what he did. You know, he had a portable typewriter and paper, and that's all he needed, and fresh ribbons. And so some of the letters, he would say, I just got a fresh ribbon. I'm so excited about it. But to him, even being published, and although he ultimately was, like sharing his work with others through a commercial vehicle, he really had to reconcile that. And so he would write his brother about that, you know. And the heartbreaking part is they were very estranged later in life. I mean, Malcolm really saw his older brother scornfully because he saw his older brother as bourgeois. You know, Harvey had been a writer, and I guess he had been a writer of promise. And he went to work on Wall Street, but then he left it. And he holed up in a room writing novels. So, but by that point, there was no relationship.
You know, when I think about his life, he was not interested in permanent obscurity. He made it a point to send every one of his self-published books to the McGill Library. He'd gone to McGill, class of 1954. And in the McGill Library, there is a box in the rare books collection of his papers and letters, which he had sent to them, often trying to sell it to them. In the stacks of the McGill Library is the world's greatest collection, outside of my house now, of the poetry of Malcolm Miller. Their collection is imperfect, but with the books I have, it would make a complete work, and I think the ultimate resting place of Malcolm Miller's self-published books should be the McGill Library. He was always proud that he went to McGill. In his biographical note, which he used for the first 15 or so of his publications, he would say Malcolm Miller was born in Salem, Massachusetts. He's a graduate of McGill University and served in the U.S. Navy.
While I was with him that short period of time, it may have been, I don't know, 2 months, 3 months, he told me about, he had gone to McGill University when he was younger, and he had been friends with Leonard Cohen. And he told me that the reason that Leonard Cohen made it big and he didn't was that they were fellow poets together and colleagues, but Leonard Cohen knew music and he didn't know music. But Leonard was a good friend of his and would send him $100 every now and then. And I was with him when he had an envelope and he opened it and it was from Leonard Cohen, and he took it out and it was $100 and he showed it to me.
He was living on Leonard Cohen's couch, and I even think Leonard Cohen would sometimes pay Mal for poems, because Mal once wrote me and said that Leonard Cohen was going to use one of his poems for a song. Now, I never found that song, so I don't know what happened. And that could have just been, you know, Leonard Cohen, because Mal lived on his couch for quite a while in Montreal. And when Mal would go back and forth to Montreal, he would stay on his couch. And it could have been just one artist helping out another, or one artist supporting another. And Leonard Cohen may have, I think genuinely liked and respected Mal as an artist. He would get Leonard to write letters to my grandmother on her birthday. And so I have this postcard from him, and the front of it are penguins. And it would be just the driest postcard. Hello, Alice Miller. Your son Malcolm asked me to wish you a happy birthday. So I'm wishing you a very happy birthday. So it was great.
Here is an email of interest. Sorry, friends. Completely out of the loop. Serious medical problems. Wish you the best of luck. I was very fond of Malcolm. Leonard Cohen. That was on April 9th, 2016.
The winds have all died down now. The books are on the shelves. The city dreams of celebrated names. The old man's in the ground now. People fool themselves into thinking there's fair rules to every game. The years end here where the land meets the sea. Rain-swept streets last longer than parades. No sad goodbye for a wanderer who never said hello. It's a song without ending, a song without ending.
He had a sharpness that infuses all of his poetry, but he also had something of a crazy side, and I mean that literally. The first time we met, he got a little apologetic and a little nervous, but he told me that there were voices that he could hear and that he thought it might be the government that was trying to infiltrate his thinking. And if that's not a symptom of paranoia, I don't know what is. However, this was not something that characterized him all the time. It seemed to have been there at that moment and then disappeared. But when you go through that with somebody, it does change how you see him.
I came across him once, these are chance meetings, and he said that he was being harassed with telephonic equipment. And he said he talked to a police officer in Marblehead, I thought he said. And the police officer, yeah, it's very, very possible somebody could do that.
And so the big thing that happened was that we went away and we asked Patty to stay at our house.
Yeah.
And I assumed that she and Malcolm made use of it and that he was staying there because we weren't there. And Julie, my daughter, who was in her teens at the time, had been given her grandmother's diamond ring. And she kept it in her jewelry box, and she was going to use it when she got married. And the first thing she did when she came back was check, and her ring was gone.
Malley has cited 3 people as harassing him with telephonic equipment. One was a lady that a couple that he used to know in Marblehead. The woman, he cited her in the complaint, somebody else, and then somebody very close to me who would not want their name mentioned in connection with this. And Malley had cited them for harassing him with telephonic equipment. This person had been very good to him and been a good friend, and the person was very upset.
So I had no doubt in my mind at all that Malcolm had taken it. And so I said to Patty, speak to Malcolm, please tell him it has sentimental value and we want it back, just give it back. And she reported that he hadn't done it. He told her that he hadn't taken it. So then became a series of letters that he wrote unsolicited, saying things like, oh yeah, I pawned your ring and spent the $1 million I got for it on Pop-Tarts. Now, I just made that up, but it would be, because it was a long time ago, but it would be a confession encoded in something so ridiculous that you couldn't bring it to the police.
I went down to Pioneer Terrace where his mother lived. His mother and I had talked on the phone, and she was concerned, and she had a realistic view of this, that he was not behaving right and there was something off and that perhaps he should even go away for a while. I talked to him, I said, Malley, you should not have done this against this person. And he said, don't you want to know what happened to this? Don't you want to know who's doing this? And then he said something about my rights are protected under the First Amendment. Well, I have some knowledge of that through my teaching, and he just wouldn't back down. And I said, Malley, I think this threatens our friendship.
But it was clear to me that he was acknowledging that he had taken it, and what was I going to do about it? So after a while, he probably thought he was teasing me, but I felt like he was tormenting me. So after a while, I just didn't open them, threw them away, and he eventually stopped.
Oh, he liked writing letters. He would write letters to me, and he would address it to the incendiary Tensor Street. And then he would write inside, I have friends who like to play with matches. I think this was after he and Patty weren't having their relationship anymore. And perhaps he might have had the idea that I disapproved of him and I had something to do with Patty going on in her life.
During Mel's homelessness, he was found in Boston. Now, he had lived on the streets. As far as we could tell, he had lived on the streets for a few weeks. He hadn't changed his clothes. He had, relieved himself in his clothes. I mean, he really sort of went off the edge. And he was found screaming and ranting in Chinatown in Boston. And so his oldest brother, Harvey, came down, and this is secondhand, although I did speak to Mal after it, which was great, and committed him to the Danvers State Hospital.
One day, we saw some posters all around town that were drawn, and it had a puppet master with a puppeteer with people, and it said Lynn, my name, and then it had puppets, and it had Patty and my kids and my husband as puppets, and then it said puppet show, 3 o'clock Sunday, some date, come to the puppet show. And they were posters that he posted all around town.
Yes, he did have a knack for self-publishing, didn't he?
Mel got out, and I happened to go to Massachusetts soon after. And so we met at a diner in Salem, and he said, oh yeah, I was just doing research. So he saw it as he was doing research for a play. And that, I think, the thing that was tragic about it is that it drove home this idea that Malcolm really was mad. And I think it was just, sometime I think he just fell apart. And I think he fell apart because of the loneliness.
I would say paranoia was definitely one of the words that I would use. The police are here. He felt that we were watching him. I remember on at least a couple of specific occasions, he thought that I was following him on the campus, which I wasn't. If we're doing our rounds or coming through, or if we got called there, he would ask why we're watching him, and that really wasn't the case.
Eventually, I think he saw behind who I was and why we could not continue being together, because I just, he was unkind, and so I stopped writing to him, stopped having anything to do with him, even though he begged me to write to him and tell him in my own hand that it was over between us. And this is in 1992. I had been married for 7 years.
Actually, around that time, I had the rug. I had an oriental rug, and it was stolen. And I had a speaker system, and it was stolen. And I always thought it was an inside job, that Malcolm knew about these things, and Malcolm had done it.
Mal was truly an independent person, but, and this is just me guessing, but when Sandra got sick, when his wife got sick, she went back to Canada because they had national health and they had no money. She couldn't afford any kind of health coverage here. And Mal wasn't with her when she died. And I think that was something, just the loneliness of that. I don't think he ever expected to be alone for as long as he was. But it was hard for him to sustain a relationship because, when you're homeless, that's living in a tent, and this very nomadic life that he had, he could never find a partner to willing to kind of take that ride with him and live that kind of life.
Memorial Day 1993 in New England. Tourists tag along with one another. Many have small maps. The universe is large and swiftly changing today. No parade and not much happening in the streets. Occasionally, a shapely pair of legs or rear provides a burst of hope. Clouds follow sun and are replaced by sun, as if the sky is some sort of fashion center showing its wares. Nobody I can detect is remembering the glorious dead. Yet some did die gloriously. And for what lets me write these words?
Later on, many years later, probably 30 years later, I had a friend who was going to Salem State College, and Malcolm lived near there, and he used to go to the college to use the library. And I didn't know this, but my friend bumped into him in the library, and he was talking to me about that he had met this man who was a poet and how interesting he was. And I said, that sounds like Malcolm Miller. And I said, ask him his name. He did. And I said, oh God, I used to know him. Tell him I said hello, and tell him that I'm an attorney now. And so he did, and so I gave him my office address, and he started sending me books of poetry that he was doing, and so I amassed several of them and read them, and I had a connection again with Malcolm for a while. And then I heard that he passed away about a year ago, and so I was sad to hear that, but I'm glad that I got to know him. He's truly an artist.
I was not around when he died. Apparently, Meals on Wheels at that point was helping him with his food. They knocked on his door and got no answer, and that led to the police coming and finding him dead on the floor. Much to my surprise, because I hadn't known him very long, he had listed me and another fellow, Peter Erkowitz, who worked at the Salem State Library, as his emergency contacts. And as far as the housing authority went, that was like being next of kin. And so I was drawn into the closing down of his apartment and the early arrangements for whatever funeral he would have.
When somebody dies and there's no family member there, and I spent over 25 years of my career in detectives and investigated every type and manner and circumstance of death, and I can tell you it was always a sad situation when somebody died alone, no matter what the circumstances were.
I know that that he was harsh to other people, but really never to me. He was always very polite, and he always had that sort of off-kilter sense of humor. I quite enjoyed him as a friend, and I regret now, of course, not having sat him down and talked to him more, but it never seemed like that was what he wanted. If I ever asked him to meet anywhere, he generally was busy.
Burying Malcolm Miller became an interesting challenge too, that even though there was the hundreds and hundreds of dollar bills which were found eventually in his kitchen drawer by the Salem police, all of his assets were put into probate, and none of it could be used for any purpose, including the funeral home. And the wishes of his family, his niece and I agreed was to have him cremated, but they couldn't even cremate him until the question of who's going to pay for it was settled. So he was kept in a refrigerated room for quite a while. And so his ashes were buried in the Green Lawn Cemetery in Salem on the hill where the veterans lie in repose.
So for about 15 years, we didn't know where he was. He had no phone. And then I started Googling him when I was able to, when Google became Google. And every couple of months, I would try to see if there were any hits on Malcolm. And the reason was, years ago, I think it was the Salem Evening News or the Danvers Herald, ran a large picture of Mal at the beach, and they referred to him as the poet of Salem. And we had saved that, you know. So who knew? Maybe he'd end up in the paper again. I couldn't find him, and then one day I found a letter to the editor, signed Mal. And up to that point, all I was hearing were these rumors. You know, they always thought he was crazy.
He was too big, too larger than what I could ever rise up to be. And people say I've put him on a pedestal that he didn't deserve, but you have to realize that he had this amazing gift that does not come along very often. I consider him one of the greatest poets. And now I wish that in his later years I could have risen to the occasion and gone to see him and told him how important those early years were. But I never did, and so now I'm feeling pretty sad about all that.
I was afraid I'd leave my windows open in the summer and the front porch would be available and people could just climb in through the windows if anybody really wanted to. And so I got scared, and I would put a lot of things on the windows so that I would hear them falling if Malcolm came to invade my house, because I was so afraid of him.
I think I was certainly blessed to know him, and I'm glad that I did. And we got somewhat close, but we never talked about it, particularly in our early years. But it was obvious that somehow we hit it off. And I think I was just glad to have known him. And he wrote me a letter in, I think, '68 and said, "I am now known as a great poet." And you have that letter. He said, "But it really doesn't mean much." And I think that kind of registered with me, that kind of reminded me of Van Gogh or somebody that, becomes a great artist, a poet, but it really doesn't mean much at the time. Maybe it will in the future. I certainly hope it would.
I will say that there was a mix of him, because in addition to sending me these letters to stir up my unhappiness about the loss of the diamond ring, he also sent me some of his chapbooks. And I think I was writing for the Boston Globe at the time, and I think he wanted my approval. I have no idea whether they were good or bad. I just felt anything from him was so toxic that I just threw them away. So I never really appreciated his poetry or was interested in them.
And so every couple of months I would Google, and every couple of months I would find another letter. And he wrote one to the Jewish Forward, and it was so, I'd yell into the kitchen to my boyfriend, found another. It was great. And then I Googled one day, and I found his obituary. And that was how I found out he died. And it was just like this moment of complete disbelief in both. He was so robust. I mean, this was a man who, when I say walk 20 miles a day, I'm not exaggerating. He thought nothing of walking to Marblehead to walk to the water, or walking through Lynn, or he would walk to Revere, or he would walk to Swampscott and walk the shore, and he was just somebody that, he was one of these people you just never thought he'd die. And I had this sort of fantasy that I'd find him and we'd have that final chance to, sit down together. And it's kind of like, wow, man, so this is who you are,
Because I got to Malcolm Miller's apartment before the city cleaned it out, I was able to collect all of the remaining self-published books that he had on hand, as well as a considerable stack of unpublished writing, novels, plays, short stories. In all, he published 58 of these self-published collections, and that's in addition to the 3 that were published more legitimately in the late 60s and early 70s. I've taken it on as my mission to go through his writing and try to collect the best of his poems. His poems exist in no other form, and I'm typing them out into my computer so we have digital versions of them. It's a long process. I think he had something like 3,500 poems. I'm going through his books. yet to find it repetitive, even though some of the themes repeat, and I'm constantly caught by surprise by something that is thrilling or fresh.
This is the end. I have failed you. I do not have the genius to reinvent your soul. I have only talent. I bid you goodbye. Though you may see me from time to time, here and there.
The gods might eventually sing. The grate of curled leaves the wind drags across my path is music, and the special chill of dark October morning, something my skin marries year after year. I am up early again, outside the pull of death. I am bound for somewhere else. Near the outskirts of the city, the sun might find me. I will be watching, and watching as the road turns this way and that. As I try for the never-before seen, who knows, the gods might eventually sing.
The book is in the mailbox, the check is in the wind. Feels like a hard rain is overdue. The leaves have all turned color now. The branch begins to bend, and the old man in the mirror looks like you. The years end here where the land meets the sea. Rain-swept streets last longer than parades. No sad goodbye for a wanderer who never said hello. It's the song without ending, calling no one so everyone can hear. The streets of this old city saw history unwind. Some famous names are more than local lore. But the man in this apartment never goes outside. What's out there, he asks his own closed door. The years end here.
Here's one. The philosophy department of Tulsa University believes sincerely life does have meaning. All 16 members of the department back this. Well, I think he's a terrific poet. And it would be nice if we could get a real collection of his poetry. And it's worth giving such a collection to a young poet who's about to sit down and write a prescribed poem according to the instructions of the person in charge. Write a poem that starts with red hair and ends with red hair, you know, whatever they do in the workshop.